So in this video, we're going to look at how do we take a web application and deploy it to Kubernetes, but more specifically Azure Kubernetes. And we're not going to focus on the infrastructure side of Kubernetes, but purely on the development and deployment side of it. Here I've got a project in GitHub, and if you followed my Azure Container Apps video, that I did a while back, you'd recognize it. So I've got three projects here over here, or services. This is what it looks like. So we've got an Angular front end container that will be served up, and the front end makes use of a .NET API backend, and that .NET API backend will call a lucky number service, which is also a .NET container, which should not be available publicly, but it's essentially a little service available only to the web API backend. Here's the Docker Compose file in the solution, and it basically fires up the lucky number generator, the web API, and the Angular images. So let's quickly start that up. Now it's up and running. You see the three services have started. So if I create a new tab over here, localhost. So when I call weather, for instance, this calls the web API, and lucky number is that hidden service that's behind the API layer. So this is essentially the Angular front end that calls, when I click lucky number, it calls the web API backend. The web API backend then routes the call through to the lucky number generator and returns the result. But let's get this into Kubernetes. So the first thing we need is a cluster. And right now I've got a resource group without an AKS cluster in there. So there are a bunch of ways you can create this. The first and most obvious way is to either find it over here, but you just create it via container, Kubernetes services, or you can just search for it. Another very common way is to go AKS. You can say create, if I can type, my goodness. And over here, you define your resource group, etc., and your properties. But something that I've done is I've created an AKS bicep file. And this is fairly straightforward as well. So if you're not sure what bicep is, you can just check out the video about bicep. But essentially, it transpiles it to ARM and runs it from there. So it's just a single managed cluster. You define the name, location, and a few basic properties that I've defined. And so let's run that. So here I am in my GitHub actions, and I'm going to run this deploy AKS infrastructure, and that essentially just runs the bicep file. You don't have to do it this way, and we just need a cluster. So the deployment is done, and you'll see it created a Kubernetes cluster. If we go to that resource group over here, also just something to note as well, it can be a bit confusing in the beginning, is when you create a Kubernetes cluster, it also creates another resource group automatically for you. It stands for managed cluster, the name of your resource group, cluster name, and then your location. So, and in here are all the pieces that make up the Kubernetes cluster. So you've got your load balancer, your public IP address for your external facing endpoint, so that you can actually hit the cluster, manage identity, your VNet, all that good stuff. Right now, I'm not going to jump into those details. So we actually want to get our app hosted in this cluster. So how do we do that? Because this is essentially just a basic empty cluster we've just created. So let's go to Angular over here and create our first deployment. Let's name the file AKS deployment.yaml. We can take a look at the documentation. That's always an option, and see what we have over here, for instance. However, I'm using the extension from VS Code, and that allows us to just use some snippets over here. So we'll use the deployment let's call it front end app. I'm not going to jump into all the details of what deployments and services and all of that is, but we basically want to create a deployment with certain number of replicas. So this actually is from, if you're interested, from Copilot, that's suggesting let's define the replicas. So let's say we want 3 replicas. So basically we are saying we want to deploy something. What is that something? It's the image, and we want to have so many replicas. And these pods are going to be defined with this label. And sorry, this label, well, I've all made it all the same. And so when a service then says, all right, I've got to match certain label, it will then say match this label and say, okay, I'm going to expose the front end app through the service. So it's port 80. And now we need to get the image. We'll quickly take a look at Docker Hub. Remember, this is already an application we've already built. The images previously, they're up there in Docker Hub. So I'm just going to use this as is. Let's get that. And then the tags. Versioning is quite important. So one thing to note is that ideally you don't want to be using the latest tag. That just helps with knowing what version you have, being more explicit. You can deploy multiple versions, and so what I'm currently doing is just being lazy. So I always just overwrite the deployment to the latest, and then we get it from there. Now we need to define a service. So this will create a deployment with 3 pods that are running. And so we basically got these 3 copies, the replica sets of this image. So it's going to basically go to Docker, pull these this image, create 3 containers in the pods, and we need to somehow expose that to the outside world. So we will create a service. So let's see if we can do. Don't know why the snippet's now not showing. Let's do service and then just paste the rest back up here. So this is just to separate items. So I'm going to grab the service over here. We can metadata is not that important, but here's the selector. So we're saying this service will find all the labels front end app and serve it through this service over here. So what we've got, we haven't done anything fancy, so it's literally just port 80, port 80. What we'll do. So the target port is from the Docker file, and I think that is 80. Yes, it is. Well, that's pretty much that, and we can now hit kube control apply. Once again, I've actually set this up already in a deployment pipeline, making it a little bit easier, and basically that will then put the deployment there. What I do want is quickly to add the same deployments and services for the other 2, and then we will run and see what happens. I've created 2 more files. The one is for the web API. I've done the exact same thing. The only difference is that I've actually pointed it to the web API Docker image, and the other one to the lucky number. Now, to expose the service on the outside, we actually have to define, there are various types over here. So we need to say type, and the options are cluster IP, load balancer, node port, external name. So load balancer is out external facing with a specific IP, or cluster IP is an internal, so it's a load balancer, but it's only accessible via from inside the cluster. And then a node port is via the IP and a node to hit a specific to hit specific pods. So what we want is a load balancer. So we want it publicly available. This is the front end. So the web API we also want publicly available. So because remember, from the browser you need to be able to hit it. So let's say that as well. Load balancer. However, on the service, when it comes to the service that we want to hide, we want to go cluster IP. And that just means that from the internet, public internet, we won't be able to hit the lucky number service. But from within the cluster, the web API will be in the cluster. It will be able to reach. So let's deploy this. Let's stage these. Added a case deployment. And let's run it. While the deployment is running, just quickly want to explain from a deployment perspective. Usually if you just deploy a web app, we've got our Git repository. In this case, it's GitHub, but it goes directly to the source. But remember, it's with container apps, it was the same, but with Kubernetes, we first need to deploy to some Docker registry. And you can use Azure Container Registry. I've just used Docker Hub. It's free for your public repository, so you can do that. So the pipeline or the GitHub actions that I've used will basically build the Docker files. We deploy it to Docker Hub, and then it's over there. And then we deploy to AKS, and by saying deploy, we're actually running our YAML files and applying them. So what that will then do is it will notify the cluster of a certain state that we're looking for. It's going to pull a certain version or the latest and do its checks and pull that down. Start up the pods with the latest image or specific version or whatever we defined and run that in the cluster. So once that's deployed, we can hop over to services. And now we should see the services that got deployed. So the ones that we created are these three. So Lucky Number app doesn't have an external ID because it's a cluster IP, but the other two are external IPs. So if I go over here, I should be able to see this. However, this won't work. If we jump back to our application in the Docker Compose, it was actually set up with environment variables. So Angular needs to know where's my API, and the web API needs to know where's my Lucky Number service. So we need to take this then and basically create some environment variables, and I'll create it right after the image, and environment, name, API, and then look at that, it's really cool. We can use the IP because that's all we have at the moment. But the problem with that is we first have to deploy it so that we can get a public IP. And this is a static IP now, and that got created in the other resource group. But now that we have it, we can update it. But that's a bit of a two-step thing. So there's something else that we can do as well. We hop over to the web API, and over here, we can actually create annotations and define a DNS label name for this service. If we go into if we refresh this over here, and we look at the public API, the IP address that was created for us with the load balancer, it has no DNS name, both for the front end and the back end. And so what we will now do is we will define one. Over here, what we'll do is that is our address. So we can say web API, this is the DNS label we gave it, the location, and then our Azure fully qualified domain name. So let me quickly do it with the others as well, with the lucky number. So I want the lucky number to be available by name. So lucky number app also has a DNS label now. And if I jump over to the web API, looking at Docker Compose, we need a lucky number service API URL. And if I jump over there to the environment variable, the only thing is with Kubernetes, the colon needs to change to 2 underscores. And then over here, we don't do this because remember the lucky number app isn't publicly available. So it's a cluster IP. So what we can do there is we say default, this is our namespace. We're using default namespace, and you can say .service.cluster.local. And that is a way where we can use a DNS name while still accessing a endpoint that's not available on the public internet. While that's deploying, we can quickly have a look. Now you'll see on the public IP address, we've got a DNS where before that was blank. Just a few other notes also while it's just busy deploying. This doesn't use any volumes, for instance. We can quite easily do that with Kubernetes, create a persistent volume and then a persistent volume claim. And all the documentation there is available, and you can create a volume, and then after that as well, you can create your claim, and then you use your claim as well within your deployment. So there are no managed options for custom domain, but you can create a DNS zone or something like that, or it doesn't have to be within Azure, but basically use a CNAME for this now. Or you can use the IP, because it's a public IP. You can use the A in the DNS, an A record or a CNAME record, and you map your custom domain to these, and that will work just fine. So it looks like the deployment is finished. So let's quickly go in here and refresh. And now we should be able to go over here to the front end. We can either use the IP address, or we can use the front end ECUS, so the DNS label. There we go. Check the weather. That should hit the web API, and then lucky number that goes all the way through to the end. If you are interested with regards to the GitHub actions or the pipelines, please feel free to have a look at the GitHub repository under Neil's filter deploy options. And so this was a combination between the container apps as well as AKS with some environment variables. It is a little bit convoluted, just all dumped in there together. It's not the greatest code, so I didn't want to show it in this video, but feel free to take a look at that and how the deployment worked.